Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating microscopic journey, looking at how your body balances fluids while simultaneously defending itself against a constant barrage of microscopic threats. We're going to look under the hood at the lymphatic system. Honestly, it's one of the most underappreciated marvels of human physiology. It's literally acting as both your body's cellular plumbing system and its high-security surveillance network all at once.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to kick things off with the fluid tug-of-war, map out the lymphatic drainage network, and then meet the immune troops in our innate and adaptive defenses section. After that, we'll cover specialized cell-mediated immunity, vaccines and artificial immunity, and finally, we'll wrap the whole shebang up with a real-world clinical application, lymphedema.
All right, Section 1, the fluid tug-of-war. Let's look at the physical forces at play right at that critical junction where your blood meets your tissues. Every single cell in your body relies on your bloodstream for nutrients, but the blood doesn't just wash over your cells directly. There's this highly regulated exchange system happening.
It's a constant push and pull, and it's governed by what we call Starling forces. These forces dictate exactly how fluid leaves the arterial end of a capillary to nourish your cells and how it gets pulled back into the venous end. Honestly, just think of it like a giant tug-of-war. On one side, you've got capillary hydrostatic pressure, literally physically pushing fluid out of the blood vessel and into the tissue space. And on the flip side, capillary colloid osmotic pressure, which is driven by these big plasma proteins, is trying its hardest to pull that fluid right back in. So at the arterial end, the outward push wins, filtering fluid into the tissues. But at the venous end, the inward pull takes over, reabsorbing most of it back into the blood. Now, what's really interesting about all this is the math. Despite this elegant push and pull, it is not a perfect one-to-one exchange. Actually, only about 85 to 90% of the fluid gets reabsorbed back into your venous blood. That leaves a very crucial 10 to 15% stranded, left behind in the tissue spaces. We call this leftover fluid interstitial fluid. And to put that into perspective, if that fluid were to just sit there with nowhere to go, you'd swell up like a water balloon in a matter of hours. Which brings us to Section 2, the lymphatic drainage network. So what exactly happens to that remaining 10 to 15% of fluid? Let's check out the anatomical drainage system that's designed specifically to handle this exact excess. Once this excess fluid enters the system, it gets a new name, lymph, and it takes a strictly one-way trip. It starts by slipping into these microscopic, blind-ended lymphatic capillaries that are just woven all throughout your tissues. From there, it travels up into larger lymphatic vessels, which are equipped with one-way valves. Those valves are absolutely crucial to prevent backflow. Along the way, the lymph passes through lymph nodes, kind of like security checkpoints for filtration, moves into the lymphatic trunks, and finally, it dumps safely right back into your venous bloodstream at the subclavian veins near your collarbones. But here's the wild part. Unlike your cardiovascular system, which has this powerful, dedicated heart to pump blood, your lymphatic system doesn't have a central pump at all. Because it lacks that central heart pump, it relies entirely on passive external forces. This means that every single time your skeletal muscles contract, like when you're just taking a walk, you're physically squeezing these vessels and pumping your lymphatic system. Breathing heavily creates pressure changes in your chest that actually pull lymph upward, kind of acting like a respiratory pump. Heck, even the gentle pulsing of your nearby arteries helps massage that lymph along its one-way journey. Moving on to Section 3, innate and adaptive defenses. So as this fluid travels, it enters those lymph nodes we mentioned. These act as vital security checkpoints, which introduces us to our immune troops. Because the lymphatic system isn't just plumbing, right? It's the superhighway for your body's defense forces. Basically, you have two complementary lines of defense protecting you. First up are the fast-acting first responders of the innate immune system. We're talking neutrophils, macrophages. They react fast, like in minutes to hours, using pattern recognition receptors to spot broad molecular patterns on microbes, but they don't have long-term memory. Then you've got the highly calculated adaptive immunity. Now this response takes days to ramp up, but it is incredibly specific to the exact pathogen you're facing. And most importantly, it generates long-lasting immunological memory. That's why you usually don't get sick from the exact same bug twice.
So what bridges these two worlds? Well, it's a remarkable cell called the dendritic cell. You can really think of them as the intelligence officers of the immune system. A dendritic cell will just hang out in your tissues, ingest a foreign pathogen, process its proteins, and then physically travel through those lymphatic vessels we just mapped out. Once it reaches a lymph node, it hands over those enemy profiles, what we call antigens, directly to the specialized adaptive immune troops that are just waiting in reserve.
Okay, Section 4, Specialized Cell-Mediated Immunity. Once those intelligence officers deliver their briefing, it is time for the heavy hitters, which originate from your bone marrow, by the way, to step up and get to work. This highly specific adaptive response is divided into two main arms. On one side, we have cell-mediated immunity. This is driven by T lymphocytes, which matured in your thymus. You've got your CD8+ cytotoxic T cells. These act like assassins, directly killing your own cells if they've been infected by a virus. And you also have CD4+ helper T cells, which are essentially the generals coordinating the entire battle. Then, on the other side, we have humoral immunity, where B cells step up to the plate to deal with threats that are floating around outside your cells.
Now, when B cells get activated, they actually clone themselves and turn into plasma cells. And these plasma cells are basically just antibody factories. They pump out millions of Y-shaped antibodies that flood your body's fluids. And these antibodies have three primary actions. First, neutralization, where they physically block a virus from entering a cell. Second is opsonization, which is just a fancy science way of saying they coat the pathogen like a sticky glaze so macrophages can easily recognize and eat it. And third is complement activation, which triggers a cascade of plasma proteins to literally punch holes directly into bacterial membranes.
Let's jump to Section 5, Vaccines and Artificial Immunity. We've seen how the body naturally fights off wild pathogens, right? But how do we artificially train these cellular troops ahead of time? Well, that brings us to the science of immunology and vaccines.
By understanding how the adaptive immune system works, scientists have developed different vaccine platforms to safely stimulate an immune response without actually causing the full-blown disease. Live attenuated vaccines use a weakened microbe to create a super strong memory response, though they usually need refrigeration. Inactivated vaccines use a killed pathogen. They're super safe, but you might need booster shots down the line. Subunit vaccines just use isolated fragments of the pathogen. And toxoid vaccines, these are cool. They teach your body to neutralize the harmful toxins a bacteria produces, rather than the bacteria itself. That's exactly how the tetanus shot works. Basically, each platform runs a safe simulation, giving your memory B and T cells some much-needed target practice.
All right, Section 6, Clinical Application, Lymphedema. Let's grind all this cellular science and fluid mechanics into a very real medical reality. We're going to look at what happens when the physical infrastructure we talked about at the very beginning actually gets compromised. Consider this clinical scenario for a second. We have a 48-year-old female patient who underwent surgery for breast cancer. As part of that procedure, the surgeons had to remove her axillary or armpit lymph nodes just to check if the cancer had spread. Now, 6 weeks later, she develops this noticeable, non-pitting swelling in her right arm. Based on everything we've covered today, why do you think this is happening? Well, the diagnosis here is lymphedema. By removing those axillary nodes and the delicate vessels connected to them, that critical one-way lymphatic highway we mapped out earlier, it was physically severed. The anatomical tubing is quite literally broken. Now remember that vital 10 to 15% of unreabsorbed fluid left over by the Starling forces? Yeah, that fluid is still being continuously filtered out of the capillaries in her arm every single minute of every single day. The production hasn't stopped. But without a clear drainage route, we get a severe physiological traffic jam. That excess fluid, along with leaked plasma proteins, just gets trapped in the arm's extracellular spaces. And here is the real kicker. Because those trapped proteins have an osmotic pull, the interstitial colloid osmotic pressure absolutely skyrockets. This effectively pulls even more fluid out of the blood and into the tissue, creating a vicious cycle of fluid retention. This tragic cascade perfectly illustrates the exact mechanism behind lymphedema. It's a direct clinical consequence of disrupting your body's plumbing. It really shows us that Starling forces aren't just, abstract concepts in a textbook. They are physical realities dictating the volume of our limbs, and they heavily rely on a functioning lymphatic system just to keep everything in check.
So, the core takeaway from today's explainer is just how beautifully and mechanically intertwined your fluid balance and your immune surveillance truly are. You really cannot separate the physical movement of tissue fluid from the transport of those intelligence-gathering dendritic cells or the deployment of specialized T and B lymphocytes. They're all sharing the exact same roads.
I'll leave you to ponder this as we wrap up today. If removing just a few lymph nodes causes such a dramatic fluid traffic jam, and we know that lymphatic flow relies entirely on passive external forces like the skeletal muscle pump,
How might everyday physical inactivity, like sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, be silently slowing down your own immune highway? It's a pretty fascinating thought, isn't it? And honestly, a great reason to get up and take a walk. Thanks so much for joining me on this microscopic journey, and keep exploring.